Welcome to Results by Design, UX Insights for Business Leaders, the podcast that dives deep into the world of UX design, strategy, and insights. Tune in, take action, and design your way to success.
Hey everyone, I'm Michael and I'm your host for today's episode of the Results by Design podcast. So today I have a very special guest. He's worked at many big brand companies, including Walt Disney, Alaska Airlines, and now Bank of America. He runs a blog called UXHow, uxhow.com, which is a resource for UX designers. He's a design leader, a former colleague and manager of mine, a friend, and all-around great guy, Troy Parke. Welcome, Troy, to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate being here today.
Hey, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast. I know it's about a month ago, you and I sat down, had a coffee, caught up after several years. And, I had to do a little bit of convincing and arm twisting to get you on the show. So I'm glad you're here.
That's all good. Pleasure to be here.
Why don't we start by telling the audience a little bit more about your journey and what you've been up to with UXHow and this new venture you're working on.
Sure. Again, thanks, Mike. It's really great to be here. I've been following along the content from you and Craig on the podcast from the start. So it's been really amazing. Just to kind of go back to the beginning, I grew up thinking I'd be an architect or an animator maybe, and I ended up being an engineer. And that's how I found my way into design and product design. And I really feel like, in my experience and what I've seen in experience with others is there really is no front door, but you can kind of connect those dots when you look backwards. And because I wasn't, scared by the technical things from my background, I was able and fortunate to grow with digital as digital grew. Still have the same loves, Legos, Hello Kitty, comic books like behind me. UXHow is my way of sharing what I learned, like our chat today and everything else from the great folks. And then Method Toolkit is something that I'm getting started. The idea is tools, not rules. That idea of focusing on methods over a single methodology.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that there isn't a front door, especially with the type of job that we have, which is considered non-traditional. It sounds like the Method Toolkit stuff is still a work in progress, huh? We'll have to bring you back on when that's done for sure.
Yep, just getting started. Maybe some teasers here today, as we unpack all this. But definitely work in progress.
Cool. Well, let's share today's topic with our listeners. It's how can business and design leaders work more effectively to generate greater value for their customers? I think this is a pretty loaded topic, so let's try to unpack it, break it down, and work our way towards the answer. Okay,
that's a biggie.
Yeah. So Troy, tell me, in the past 10 years, you've had a seat at the table with business leaders from giants such as Disney, Alaska Airlines, and now Bank of America. You know how integral business and UX are to one another. So for the companies out there that don't have business and UX joined at the hip, can you explain why it's so important that they are?
Well, first off, just like being able to grow with digital, I think I've been really lucky to work with business and product-minded design leaders. Even from your short intro there, I've had the fortune of being able to span many different domains and spaces, like whether it's transportation or retail, entertainment, finance, et cetera. Right. And I've just learned in that partnership that, UX is the business. Now, by saying that, I don't mean UX dictates, or the business is, subservient to UX in that ways, but it's just the recognition that there isn't a business without an experience for those who are, enjoying and using those products and services. So, for example, I like to kind of sometimes, try on the inverse or the reverse, right? So you cannot not design, right? Like everything is designed, whether you're trying to or not. I even go to examples like generic labels or packaging. It's still designed, and it has some sort of intent. And that's exactly what design is. Folks in the industry know a lot more than I do, like Jared Spool. That's how they define design. Design is the rendering of intent. So even the most generic, vanilla, plain, non-decorative kind of design is by intention. And so when you think of it that way, really design, UX, and business are two sides of the same coin, right? It's really a team sport for that. And again, as you kind of look through other examples out there of like, the lean UX canvas or agile tools or, problem statements, right? I mean, like a good hypothesis, for example, has to address both at the same time, the business needs and the user benefits. And I like to, the mental model I have about that is it's a Venn diagram, and it needs to overlap. And if it doesn't overlap, you really don't have a viable product.
Yeah, I agree. We reference that quite often here at UpTop. The closer we pull design, business, and tech together, the greater the experience we can create for the end user. So I'm glad you referenced that. Can you share an example that you've experienced where there was a major disconnect between business and design?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you don't have to look too far for, examples big and small. Investing in foundational work like a design system versus the next feature, or pricing strategies for a service or a product that's not easily presented. I mean, those are, that's a disconnect.
Can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, let me think of an example here. So for example, I try and use an everyday example of like pricing for a concert or an event ticket, right? You have a lot of information to convey, right? That someone needs to confirm. It's like the performer, the date, the time, where they're playing. And then that biggest factor is like, okay, well, where is the seat? What's the view? What's the, that is. And so in order to kind of convey a lot of that, like a very typical model, and it is to have a seating chart, but that's a pretty complex form factor, right? To sort of, show all that information. And then when you try and reduce it down to make it less complex to something like best seats, right? It's like, okay, well, what does that even mean? Is that the best seats that are there, best seats available? Is price some sort of proxy for view, right? And so it creates a lot of mental trade-offs for cognitive load, in that particular example. In terms of like a real personal example for me that I experienced is, there was a bit of a disconnect when at the time I was at Alaska Airlines. They had recently purchased Virgin America. And, it really was this opportunity, I think, in the grandest sense, of bringing the best of both together, right? That idea of like, Alaska had award-winning customer service. Virgin had a really, award-winning app, state of the art kind of technical implementation, right? It really, seemed like, okay, we'll bring the best of both together. But business was kind of looking this a little bit more of like an airline of, okay, well, we need to widen our area of service, capacity, number of gates, number of routes, those kinds of things. And so, ultimately, that's really what governed, right? That idea, and it logically makes sense, right? And especially as we started, really uncovering, hey, there's real challenges. I mean, like impossibilities of, for instance, tying in backends together or integrating. And then once the decision was made overall to, okay, well, the brand going forward would be Alaska. It's like, okay, that's the path forward, right? And so, but I will say in all honesty, right, like even for myself, like I was a little bit disconnected from the business or business, mindset, from that for some time.
Yeah. I actually forgot that acquisition happened. I do remember Virgin having a lot of brand equity.
No.
I'm wondering if it were left up to you, would you have kept the Virgin brand?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to consider more than just the brand. I mean, Virgin obviously has, Richard Branson and everything else, but I mean, that's a little bit above my pay grade. But I mean, what I will, kind of mention is that, there's a lot of, when you think of this industry of, airlines, for example, there's been a lot of great airline brands of yesteryear. And then it's playing out today, right now, right? Like, Alaska is, in the process of acquiring Hawaiian Airlines, right? And I mean, I love that logo, but that may not continue either.
I hope it does stay for sure. I love it too. You just shared a really great example from Alaska. Thinking back to the organizations you've worked for, what are some of the characteristics that you've seen that could be red flags? And do you have any suggestions for how to approach them?
Kind of want to take a few steps back on this one. Every situation in business is really different and really dynamic. And I think tracing, the tensions in a digital product space you can kind of look back to a couple of different reasons, like how the business started, right? Like how it got off the ground. Or, once it's off the ground, how does it really ultimately earn revenue or profit, right? And turn profit. I mean, there's an example in the news today that I thought was really interesting. It's come out. It's like Google's trying to place search, right, on Apple products. And there's a whole significant revenue stream that's going to Apple to just place Google, right? I mean, that's got to affect their product strategy. And so I think that first understanding is just acknowledging like how a business really works, right? And so Mike, I mean, we were at Big Fish Games, right, together, and worked for many years, but ultimately we knew, being a part of that organization, that effectively was a startup and it had a personality at the helm, right? And the company was eventually acquired, and I wasn't a part of that, but likely that was probably the goal from the start, right? Or a likely outcome that they were aiming towards. And so, but that dynamic shaped everything that we worked on. Everything from what products were offered to what things were invested in to, even what pivots were being made against competitors at the time, like, PopCap or whatnot. I do think it's worthwhile to, when you're walking in, a situation, or you're trying to assess, it's okay to put on that engineer hat or thinking like an accountant. It's not a bad way to start. Like kind of just really analyzing almost like a scientist. Like, is the business profitable? How is it profitable? Are processes pretty, ad hoc, or is it really defined? Is it really rigid? Is the entity public? Is it trying to go public? Is it just going to stay private, family owned, right? Like whatever. So now to kind of like, okay, with that kind of context, then to me, the business red flags would be is like when what is being said, is not how it happens or how it really unfolds. And then I think there's also, to be honest, I mean, there's two sides of this. There's like red flags for yourself, red flags for you. When an individual is, not being honest with themselves, right? About, what it is they're looking for, or what it is that they, or how they're trying to contribute and add to this. So then I think the big part here is what matters most is if your values are in alignment with the organization or group or team, right? Or not. And so, for example, if you're looking at yourself and you're like, hey, I like wearing a lot of hats. I like being able to, take on a lot of different things. That when we were at Big Fish, Mike, we did not only product design roles, but we also did marketing design roles. I mean, it was very, very, kind of expanded and touching a lot of different things. But neither of us got the chance to go dive deep and like, okay, I want to be a focused expert on something like design systems, right? Or interaction design or whatnot. I mean, it just wasn't, what was needed. And so if you're looking, for example, that kind of predictability and focus in your role, and that you're probably then going to need to do something that's, likely a larger entity, maybe more mature in terms of a business industry, and that's probably going to be more aligned. So, that'll be great from that standpoint. I can be a subject matter expert. I can dive deep into these things, but the trade-off is going to be is like, you're not going to get that range. You're probably not going to be able to get to be, going blue sky every day, right? With like brand new things, each sprint. So, and I recognize too, I've been in those situations, right? Like it seems like that's a bit mismatched. How do you cope? And I think the first is you just kind of got to recognize like where you're at, where the business is at. Sometimes you can then kind of pick up on those signals, right? And invest like where you can build that more alignment on things. And then, sometimes mixing and matching is not a bad thing, right? Like, one thing that I've learned in my experience of working in-house and working agency is like, sometimes you got to, switch it up a little bit, right? Like if there's gaps in the way that things are working in-house, maybe leveraging an approach that you learned in like, the agency consulting role can kind of help fill that and augment that. And no, it's a long-winded answer, but that's a little bit of like how I kind of like personally go through and sort of assess some of these things around red flags that you're bringing up.
Yeah, no, that's really great insight. And, you're right. Organizational culture is often a representation of its leader. And I've heard many stories of employees who, come in, bring a fresh vision, a culture, and our, processes to these organizations because of where they came from, but where they're trying to bring it into our organizations that are very traditional in nature. And, they really struggle to get anywhere and at some point end up leaving. So
it really takes time. It takes time and investment. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so it really does seem like change would need to start from the top if you're going to see some broad scale sweeping changes. But yeah, it is a very big challenge. I agree. So tangentially, a common challenge we see as an agency are business leaders within organizations that have some level of understanding. So I don't know if you're familiar with Nielsen Norman's 6 stages of UX maturity, but I'm thinking, between stages 1 to 3, where UX is, absent, limited, or emergent. And these folks are still needing to justify the value of UX and, probably more so research. We've seen improvement in the past decade, but unfortunately for many out there, it is still an ongoing challenge. What would you say to those business decision makers that do not prioritize UX in the way that they should?
Yeah, this is definitely a challenge. I mean, especially, given the economy and things like that. It's a real big opportunity space. Also, it's been really hard, I think, on agencies, especially research teams, like you were mentioning. Like there's been progress, but also I think there's been, a bit of, one step forward, half step back, and in some cases, and maybe even more. My hypothesis around this, after kind of being through a few, cycles and seeing some, like you mentioned, the stages of UX maturity. Sometimes you get advanced and then you kind of backslide a little bit, The return on investment or the ROI of UX and design is often really hard to quantify. And so, when you look at it from a top level, oftentimes it can get treated like marketing, right? Or another example is, this kind of investment is thought of like a cost center, kind of like you would think of as tech support, right? Like it's just a thing to keep the lights on instead of actually being a revenue driver, right? Like it's actually integral to the business. It actually increases revenue. It's not just a cost on doing business. And so, for the teams and designers out there, I would say wanting to see it at the table. You didn't ask about this, but I know it's often like, as you talk about this maturity model, that's what you're kind of looking towards to do. And so, wanting that seat at the table means recognizing it's a business table, right? From the start, that's the table you want to be at. And so, one of the shifts that I've had to make, and I've learned from folks like Patrick Neiman is, you have to think of yourself as, I am a business person who uses design as a tool, not I'm a designer, right? And that's a subtle shift, but it's really, I think, demonstrates, again, to that larger point we were kind of chatting about earlier around, like an experience is part of the business. So for decision makers, to be honest, if you ever, we're all households, right? We're all doing our own budgets, week to week, month to month, those kinds of things. Running a business from my exposure is, that same kind of like, over constrained problem, right? Like, there's too many things to get and just try and spend money on that you want. And, nobody's happy, about that, about where you got to make some hard choices sometimes. And so, ultimately, I think when you do have the ability to do something or look at something, you're really looking at it from like an investment mindset, right? Where are there going to be returns? And, my suggestion would be is like, I think UX can help activate that. And so like an analogy I've used is investments in UX and investments in design are like compound interest, right? It can help build over time and build on top of itself. And, or to use another analogy, is a key to unlock other keys in that sense. So for example, like another way you might frame this idea is, you think about designer to developer ratios, right? It's like, okay, depending upon your business or where you're at or what you're producing, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, maybe higher, and stuff. So, and we all know that, hey, it's really imperative to keep all the developers going, right? And the developers aren't idle and you're continuing to iterate on the product and address needs. So, that might be a way that you can, justify that UX investment because you're getting that, 5 to 10x type return, like an investment, right? Of activating, those other teams. So the biggest takeaway that I would say from this and the overall key is positioning any UX investment as a business strategy, not a deliverable like wireframes, right?
Yeah, I love that phrase. Position UX investment as a business strategy, not a deliverable. Yeah, I really love that.
Yeah.
I've always said to my designers that in order to be convincing in presentations with leadership, you need to speak their language, which is the language of business. So, when selling a design, don't focus on how it aligns with the brand or how clean it looks. All that is important, don't get me wrong, but that's like Greek to a business leader. They want to know numbers, right? They want real data on how it will impact conversions or reduce customer support calls. Once you start talking their language, you've got their attention. So I think this dovetails nicely with your mindset of be a business person who uses design as a tool.
Yeah, I mean, the way that designers often approach this is like, oh, it'll speak for itself. And you don't. You have to really put it in that context for people to understand what it means.
Yep. So in your opinion, what can advocates of design do to help influence these decision makers?
I know Craig's not here, but I mean, he's the expert on influence and, and working that. I know from working with Craig. So this is a very, this is its own craft into itself, right? If you consider, design a craft and as I do and things, it's a very tailored soft skill. So, I don't have the magic elevator pitch, that gets, somebody writing checks on the spot, and that type of thing. I mean, what I found in my experiences is it really takes time. You've got to build relationships. You have to earn trust. You also have to give trust, right? I mean, that's how you earn it. And I think about things like, like Shark Tank, right? I mean, it's been on TV for, years and, it's kind of got the same, story of, like rapport, refinement and work. And that inventor, starts with some sort of problem or need, and then they bootstrap their way towards, like, hey, I finally figured out this answer that we've been looking for. And now it can be shared to the world. And I'm looking to scale and I'm looking for you to do that. And it's a total pitch, right? But it's based on experience. It's based on story. It's the story of like, this is what life was like before, and this is how life can be now, and things like that. And so, like that, I think one lesson I've learned is there really is no strategy without envisioning, right? Without painting that picture, without telling that story, without trying to show something that can't be unseen, right? It's very, 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 it can be very, very powerful, it can be very, very persuasive. Hillman Curtis, a designer from a few decades ago, would call this making the invisible visible, right? If we're giving something some form, this idea some sort of form. And there's a couple of things that, can happen once something starts to become a little more tangible, right? People want to know, oh, okay, that's great. So how do we get there from here, right? Like based on today. Or they're going to start, okay, that's another idea. They're going to compare it to other ideas that they have, that others have had, that are there. And then, that's a good place to be because, I mean, effectively now what you're doing is you're living rent free in the decision maker's mind. And that's like where you want to be, in that sense. So that's one technique, that I've used. Another one is a little counterintuitive, but I've started trying to use this one in occasions, and I think it's been helpful. But it's not asking why. And it sounds like, well, wait, what do you mean? And it's like, well, no, it's instead turning it into a how question, like turning it into like, how do we know? Or how will we know when this strategy is working, right? And the reason why is, asking why just makes people defensive, right? I mean, just think about it in everyday life. Like, well, wait, why are you doing that? Why not? Why can't we do that? Right. And when you ask a little bit more of these how questions, or even sometimes what, you get that insight and understanding the reasons behind it. And then you can offer some potential solutions like, oh, that's the thing that you're, trying to unpack or uncover or address. So then, hey, we might be able to, get to those moments faster with design, right? To help.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you on the notion of envisioning. There's something very powerful when you visualize and prototype a new idea, or if it's a reimagining of an existing product or tool. We found that it's so much easier to gain alignment when everyone is seeing and interacting with the same thing.
Yeah, at the same time. Yeah.
Yep. So when you say, how do we know? Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, and this is a new thing I'm trying on, like how do we know? How will we know? And I think, my thought around this is there's a couple of things it's really doing, right? First is, that question, what it's really asking is this based on some sort of data, or is this an assumption? Right. And again, if you were to kind of like start off of like, where's the data, right? Or why, it puts people on their heels, right? It makes things defensive. But I think that's really, really important because, as we know, designs, experiences, business is all about trade-offs. So it's super, super important to understand like, okay, we're working off of existing data or an existing assumption. And that could be completely valid. I think it's also valid to kind of say like, is this a reasonable given going forward, right? Will this continue being a valid assumption or a valid data point? Second, it sort of also kind of gives you a little bit of an in and sort of pushing on this threshold of like identifying, hey, when might not this be working, right? Like what's that moment or what are we looking for? What's that scent of information around like this might not be turning out to be the path that, is going to get us there, right? And then the third thing that just kind of came to mind here too is like, I think it's really important for folks to be curious and demonstrate that curiosity, and you might learn something. I mean, again, you're trying to kind of, learn as much as you can in those moments.
Yeah, this is a great technique to try because I know designers are trained to always ask why. Why?
Yeah.
Definitely worth trying it. Ultimately, so we want the business to better understand design and what it can bring to the table. Do you have any tips on how design professionals can better understand the business they work for?
I mean, again, geez, Mike, you're bringing the heavy questions here. I'm not an MBA, so, like, I think the way I've kind of framed this a little bit is, hey, the question, the last few years was like, hey, should designers code? And it's not obvious. My answer to that would be is like, well, they should study business first. And, wherever you can, from product peers, from online, I subscribe to a lot of product and business blogs, email lists and things. And, I think it's really important to just learn from, what you can, and invest in it. I think just to kind of unpack a few things that I've learned along the way, is language matters. It really does matter. I know we've been kind of like doing nuanced things like, oh, think of yourself as a business person who uses design as a tool, but it does matter. And, I even caught myself a little bit earlier, but it's like, I'm training myself also to say not the business ones, or we went and talked to the business, right? Like they're separate entities. You all, right? Like as working and like on in a organization, you're a partner. You're part of the business. You're delivering on that as a business. Organizations, like Disney, take this a step further, and they specifically to help with some of this mindset. Don't use user right? They say guest, right? It's intentional, like we said. So, and then when you start kind of recognizing that a little bit, I think that you can, I would encourage to use business terms to describe design activities. So leverage, right? ROI, conversion, those, like start putting that in that framework. And then the next thing that, kind of going up from there and like expanding is recognizing that you can think of business frameworks as experience frameworks. They're as we talked before, they're very closely tied together, tied at the hip. So like an easy example that I've learned is like a SWOT analysis. That's SWOT, but it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And, we have analogous activities that, we use different names for in design and in user experience, right? Like doing a UX heuristic review of your product offering or your experience compared with competitors. Same thing, right? Same idea. Like you're looking at what's good, what could be better, what's missing, right? And things. Disney has a practice of kind of following three things, right? And they're following the guest experience, they're following the cast, and following the money, right? Like you need to track those individual streams, if you will. Well, that's like doing a user journey map for each of those different domains and how they interact and how they intersect and things like that. And then to take it to the highest, most abstract level, possible, an area where I think kind of also playing around with method toolkit is this really extends to strategic, mental models for business. So many business people, entrepreneurs, they, look to Warren Buffett or Berkshire Hathaway and Charlie Munger and things like that. And it's, they use mental models. They take for decades, they've had amazing, financial returns and have ways that they look at business and what they've written about and what they share and what people pore over is like these ideas of these mental models. And one example is called the availability heuristic. And that's kind of fancy for, we tend to, as humans, recall what's important, frequent, or recent, right? And so once you kind of understand, again, going back to the idea of a key that unlocks other keys, you realize this model really does kind of get to the bottom of, many different UX and business behaviors. So there's the term called anchoring, that's based on this, which is that idea of relying too much on one data point, right? Like not looking at all the different data points. Closely related to that, would be the recency bias, right? Like you're going back to that first thing that you saw, right? Pricing uses a lot of these on both of these techniques, right? Like you saw this price or you saw this thing, and you keep going back to that mentally because you're being anchored to it and you saw it recently. And then there's, it even extends to other things like sunk costs, right? So, the sunk cost is like, well, I've spent this much time already. I might as well see it through, or, like, I'm not going to get that time or, my back. So I'll just kind of, keep going. Right. And that's something that, again, it's kind of like lock-in effect, right? Like I already got the Apple iPhone. I'll stay with Apple, or I'm already on Android. I'll stay with Android. So that's another example of like seeing that from that just model of like, that availability heuristic.
Yeah. All right. So to sum up, have a business first mindset, have a united front. And I know since working at an agency, I've subconsciously always used the word we in conversations with our clients. Yeah. I think that when you're invested in your clients' goals and outcomes as much as they are, you feel like you're on the same team. So you start to use words like that. But I do think it goes a long way.
That's a good one, Mike. Yeah.
And then third, as you just mentioned, strong parallels in frameworks for both business design. Troy, it's apparent that the more you know about the business, the more value you can add. And I'm wondering if we can, just tease out a little bit more gems from you today before we wrap up. As a consultant, we always think about how we can provide more value to our clients. So as a design leader within these big organizations, in what ways do you think about creating value?
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of stole the big thunder right there. I mean, it's value, right? That's the key. We talked about, being a viable product, but it really means, I think, for product, for design, for business mindset, it is thinking in terms of value. I mean, again, we talked about what makes a viable product, and, there aren't viable products that are currently in use that don't provide some sort of value to someone. And so, okay, so it's like, okay, that sounds great, but then how do you really like apply that and do that? And it's like, you can, frame, MVP features, right? Like, again, we can't do it all. Framing in terms of value. Great. I think most people do that. But you can also do the flip, which is when you're cutting scope, talking in terms of value, right? Like, if we don't do this has this level of impact in terms of value, right? Alaska has this, for example, had this fantastic class of like how to start and run an airline. It's super, super helpful. I mean, I'm not going to go out and start an airline, but understanding like the thought process that goes into it and what you would do to, from a regulatory standpoint, and leasing jets and, crew and, everything. It was super, super impactful to understand from the larger business perspective. I think the other, aspect is, and, in this time and place and where we tend to operate, right now, is everything kind of comes down to time and money. I mean, it's not, as like as a designer or somebody who's, it's like equating everything in that, but that's kind of like what we do, whether it's business or life. It's also because we need some sort of common denominator for framing those choices and making, doing those trade-offs and assessing a risk, right? Like a business would. And so, simple things like, hey, I'm going to go to school, or I'm going to go back to school, or something, right? Whether pursuing the education, right? Does that make sense? Is that, like what's that time value and money aspect of it? Or whether you're, working on a project and you're debating those kinds of features and stuff. I think one of my favorites that I use all the time, and Mike, we've talked about this a little bit, is like that idea of starting at the end, right? I think it's really, really, really powerful, coming at problems from the opposite direction. I've done that a few times here as I think about it today. I learned this from, kind of just reading about how Pixar, does movies. And the reason why is because endings are really, really hard, right? You really need that satisfying ending. It's got to land well. It's really complicated. And then once you have that, then you can kind of work back to the right start for that, instead of restarting over and over again, like how the beginning should go. And that's a little bit of like, we were talking mental model examples earlier, but that's kind of like what first principles thinking is, right? Like you're going backwards, you're going back to like, okay, what are those underlying assumptions? Or, you can call it reverse engineering, for example, and UX has, you talked about it earlier, right? Like the 5 whys, right? Like it might be the UX framing for something like that. And I think the quintessential example of this is, the Amazon method of working backwards from a press release, right? It really helps frame and prioritize the start of an initiative by looking at like, hey, what do we want this to say when it gets out there? What do we want the press to say? What do we want our users to say? What are the things that we want to say about, like what we're doing and delivering as a business in terms of value? And so that's a strategy I've used quite a few times.
Yeah, we're very familiar with the Amazon press release, and the start at the end sounds very much like envisioning to me. So I do think that's a really great strategy.
Yeah, it really is.
So you all just heard some truly amazing insights from Troy about how business and design leaders can come together more effectively and again, ultimately create more value for their customers. Troy, before we wrap up, are there any last thoughts you want to add?
I just appreciate the opportunity, Mike. I have the utmost respect for and appreciation for, the work that you're doing, and always valued our partnership. And I kind of feel like I've been ranting a little bit today, but hopefully it's useful for someone out there to just kind of like, try some of these things. Again, as I kind of talked about with some of the work that I'm doing is like, I'm just trying to pay back a little bit in how, I've learned from others and others have invested in me. And hopefully, try things on, kind of like trying on a wardrobe, right? And just see it. I'm a big believer in there isn't just one way of doing things, and hope this helps folks out there with their personal toolkit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really appreciate you coming on. Do come back when you have time. I know you're a busy man, but we'll always make room for you. maybe then we can talk more about your method toolkit. So Troy, please let our audience know how they can get a hold of you.
Sure. Yeah. Website is uxhow.com. And as we talked about, been working on methodtoolkit.com. So those are the ways you could reach out.
If you like today's conversation, folks, please click subscribe. Links to UX How and Method Toolkit are in the YouTube description. That's it for today's episode. Please join us next time as we explore more innovative approaches to enhance your products and services, optimize customer interactions, and ultimately drive success for your organization. Tune in, take action, and design your way to success.
Thanks for tuning in to Results by Design. If you liked this episode, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are also playing on all your favorite audio streaming podcast platforms, so stay connected and join us for the next one. Results by Design is brought to you by UpTop. Our mission is to equip business leaders like you with the knowledge and tools needed to leverage UX methods and strategies to achieve tangible business outcomes and create lasting value. Whether you're a seasoned executive or just starting to explore the world of UX, Results by Design is your go-to resource for unlocking the potential of user experience to achieve remarkable results. Tune in, take action, and design your way to success.